asked me to share about some stories about my family's relationship with Dr. King. My father, as the pastor said, was the Attorney General. Before that, he was my uncle, his brother, his older brother's campaign manager. And in October of 1960, and you remember, my uncle was running against President Nixon, who was then vice president, who had a very close relationship at that time with Dr. King, and Dr. King considered him a friend. Dr. King was arrested at a lunch counter sit-in in DeKalb County, Georgia. He had only reluctantly participated because John Lewis and some of the younger radicals had pressured him into sitting at the lunch counter. Oh, he was put in the DeKalb County jail. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the sheriff picked him up without telling him where he was going, and then took him on a long drive out to what Dr. King later called cracker country, where a lynching would not be complained about. And he was actually bringing him to the state prison at that time, but Coretta King was very worried that he was going to be murdered. And she called Vice President Nixon, but he wouldn't return the phone call. And that ended the relationship between Dr. King and Nixon. They then called Harry Belafonte, who was very close to my family and at that time was funding the civil rights movement. And Harry Belafonte gave Coretta the telephone number of my uncle, Sergeant Shriver, who was a strong advocate for civil rights. My father and my uncle, John Kennedy, had grown up in Boston. And civil rights issues and the struggle and the challenges faced by blacks all over this country was not really on their radar. It was not one of their major issues at that time. My uncle Sergeant Shriver asked John Kennedy to call Dr. King. His aides all said that would be a bad idea because he had a deal at that time with 3 Southern governors, including Governor Van Dever here in Georgia, who they said they would throw their support to John Kennedy, but if he supported Dr. King, they would go with Nixon. So his aides didn't want him to do it. And when he called Coretta, it was just a courtesy call and a kindness call. When my father found out about it a few minutes later, he called my uncle Sergeant Shriver and said, "You just cost us the election." But my father was home at that time in Hickory Hill, Virginia, where we lived. He was getting in a car to National Airport, and as he drove to the airport, he began steaming about it, about what was happening to Dr. King, because even though he didn't know anything about civil rights, he hated bullies. And when the time he got to the airport, he was in a rage. And he got his aides to get him the number of the sheriff. He called the sheriff, he called the judge, and he called Governor Van Dever, and he said, "Can you get Dr. King out of jail?" Governor Van Dever said, "I don't think I can do that." And my father said to him, "I want you to try, and I want you to tell me what you have done." The next morning, Dr. King was released, and Daddy King went to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and he switched his endorsement from Nixon to John Kennedy. It did not make the white press, but it made all the black press. And as a result of that, my uncle won the election with the narrowest margin in American history. And it was the black vote that put him over. And they never forgot about it. They supported him on the Montgomery boycott of businesses. He asked for help with the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were a new Supreme Court decision that said you can't discriminate in interstate commerce. This group of young, very, very courageous black men and women decided to test the new law by riding greyhounds across the Deep South. Their bus was burned in Anniston. They were savagely beaten. They were beaten again in Montgomery while the state troopers and the FBI stood by. Dr. King called my father, and my father sent 400 U.S. Marshals to protect them. They worked side by side with Dr. King on the Selma March, on a boycott that he was doing of businesses in Chicago, and then on the Civil Rights Bill, and they partnered in the March in Washington. And then when my dad was killed in 1968, Dr. King in April of '67 came out against the war in Vietnam. Most of the people in the civil rights movement didn't want him to do that. They said, we need to stay in our own lane. The war is not part of our movement. And Dr. King said, we can't separate the war from what's happening here, from the violence that it's bringing home. We cannot ignore the fact that 45% of every paratrooper troop in Vietnam is black. And it's black children who are fighting the war, whose lives are being sacrificed for freedoms there that they don't enjoy at home. And it's impoverishing the poverty program. The war on poverty was being bankrupted by the war. So he came out against it almost a year to the day after he made that decision. He was murdered. My father found out about his murder. My father was running for president at that time against the Vietnam War. And he found out as he was walking into a ghetto in Indianapolis. The sheriff said, we can't go in there. There's going to be a riot when they find out. My father went in alone. He gave a speech, one of the best speech impromptu of his career, where he reminded people, for the first time, he talked about his brother's death. He said, my brother was killed by a white man. And our job is to find community with each other, to tame the savageness of man, to make gentle the life of the world. And he was himself killed 2 months later. Coretta was with me. I watched my dad die. Coretta was with me at that time. She carried with our family, she carried his body back to New York in the airplane. She rode with us. And then when we brought my father from Penn Station to Union Station in Washington, D.C., there were 2.5 million people on the train track. And Coretta was with us in the train. And I grew up friends with the King's children. Yeah, I better wind down. I'm very, very grateful, again, to Pastor Alexander for giving me the chance to talk to you and to reminisce about some of these stories. And I look forward to meeting many of you afterward. Thank you very much.